This is Wee Lads, Big Problems on Trinity FM. And I'm here live in Trinity Halls, as usual, with Ryan O'Connor. And our guest this week, Oliwia Borek. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, no.
Hi, I would like to introduce myself with a joke.
Oh.
And a very good one.
If anyone else wants to be a guest, it's not too late.
And it's very relevant to the podcast today. I actually spent a solid half an hour looking at jokes today to pick the perfect one. Now, are you ready?
No.
Okay. At what time did the populism monster eat the Polish Prime Minister?
What time, Oliwia?
8 p.m.
Please help us.
It's
Save us
comedy,
from-
babes.
Save us from this eternal suffering.
Okay. Right. Moving on.
We've also got another guest. Very important guest.
Of course.
Can I introduce him?
Go ahead.
Absolutely.
Okay, so today, you may have seen already, but we have an actual infinite being on the podcast today. He is, some would say he's just immortal, but he's so much more than that. You know, immortality is just, like infinity. But no, it's not infinity. Immortality is infinity in life, but Karl Barx here is infinity in everything. He is, like, the universe.
Yeah, I just want to add for context here. This is like a small inanimate dog that we just take to lectures.
He is not inanimate, he is not small, he is infinite, and he is Karl Barx. And he will be in every first year sociology and politics lecture for this semester.
As long as Emmanuel doesn't turn off the chat. Anyway.
Should he introduce himself?
Oh yeah, Carol, would you like to say a bit about yourself? Thanks there, Carol, that's really
when he
enlightening.
says these things.
Right. So now that we've introduced the wee lads, it's on to the big problems. So we're discussing populism in Europe this week.
Yup.
We've got... Good job, Ryan. No. I'll be looking at, first of all, some of the theory about populism in general, right? And the political theory behind that and what characteristics and features it has. Poland will be dealt with by Oliwia.
Yep.
Who's actually from Poland. We have an expert.
Finally some actual representation.
Yep. And in a return to normal form, Ryan will be doing Hungary.
As a Hungarian citizen myself, I'm very excited. I'm not Hungarian, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to preface this man's from like a rural town in Donegal. No, and I will be looking at Sinn Féin and how we can relate them to populism in Europe and what are the differences. They're not as strictly populist as the others, but I think it brings in a nice angle into it. So just to start off with some general ideas about what actually is populism. So the key characteristic of populism is that it's politics framed as people versus the elites.
It's pretty much Bess versus PPS.
Oh,
That's a hot take.
it's getting spicy in the chat. Getting political in this chat, as some might say. No, so it's people versus the elites, right? And so populist parties will tend to they'll take a stance that emphasizes the idea of this pure, incorruptible people who have a singular desire among themselves for political representation. And then they'll say the elites are corrupt and against that, and that these two things are fundamentally opposed, essentially, right? And of course, the party itself always completely represents what the people want, and there's no distinction between that at all, right? Now, it's not a single consistent ideology the same way like liberalism or conservatism is. You can have right-wing populism, left-wing populism, things like that. But the key focus is this people versus the elites framework, right? Secondly then, what we're going to be looking at in each of these cases is how this popular identity is created, right? So how do we define the people and the elite in different circumstances? So a big theme today is going to be nationalism. And so the people are generally defined as the people of the nation. The elites tend to be defined as kind of like corrupt economic elites. Sometimes they can be different cultural groups. Sometimes they can be immigrants from Europe and elsewhere in the world, right? But that's what you're looking at there, right? And of course, control of the media is a big thing with populism in Europe as well, right? having control of the narratives that are spread on media is a big part of what populist parties do to stay in power, right? So, the next bit then we're looking at is the relationship to economic policy. Just to give a brief overview, populist parties tend to be more left-wing economically. They can be, I suppose you could argue that like you've got the Conservative Party in Britain, which has become populist, but then you could say that they've changed their economic policies to a more redistributive or populist stance. So it tends to be very much they oppose classic neoliberal ideas about how things should be distributed, and they go for very simple solutions to economic problems: redistribution, tax the wealthy and spend on the poor, essentially, things like that, right? But it's generally like the criticism of these platforms then is that they're irresponsible, or that they don't consider like the consequences of debt and inflation, and they're simple solutions peddled by demagogues essentially to win power and no more. So that's kind of the two views of how economic policy works, but it tends to be more left wing, more redistributive, more egalitarian in a way, more concerned with the working class as opposed to any other kind of notions about fairness and competition. And finally, the fourth characteristic we're going to briefly look at in each case is charisma and the style of leadership that's associated with it. In a lot of populist parties, you tend to get strongmen and charismatic leaders at the top who become synonymous with the party. So I know I'm going to break one of Ryan's rules here, but I'm going to mention Trump.
No. We have to shut down the podcast. The whole goal of this was to not mention Trump, and we've just ruined it. It's over. We can't do it anymore. I'm sorry, but
Trump is generally considered a populist, and he's become synonymous with the Republican Party, or at least he was for the last 4 years. We'll see how that develops, or at least we won't see that in this podcast, according to Ryan. But so that's the kind of style of leadership you're looking at. Very authoritarian. They're leaders who say that they have all the answers, and that, as Trump said, that they alone can fix it, right? And you'll see that in Poland, you'll see that in Hungary. To a much lesser extent, you might see some of that in Sinn Féin. But that is most of the overview of populism that we're going to look at. And now on to the meaty stuff.
Ooh.
If you will. Yeah. Olivia.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm pretty good. Not in the context of populism. In the context of populism, I'm doing very, very badly. Please save us.
Right. Do you want to give us some context, right?
Absolutely. This is something I really wanted to start off with, talking about populism in Poland, because I do think that people's perception of Poland is very much defined by the events of the last decade, which is completely fair enough. I was exactly the same. I mean, I was born in 2001, so by the time I was actually reading about politics and interested in what was going on, I was in my teen years, and all of this populism stuff was going around. And actually, the way I found out that wasn't the case was about a year ago. I read what's her name? Madeleine Albright's autobiography, and she was talking about making a democratic convention to just celebrate democracy in all of these different countries. And she was like, obviously, the obvious choice is to have it held in Poland, because Poland's doing so amazing and they got out of communism and they're democratizing so well. There was a really peaceful shift of power. And I was reading that thinking, really? And I literally had to ask my mom about it, and she was like, yeah, we actually used to do pretty well, which I had no idea. So I kind of want to talk about that. It's just nice to know that Poland did start off. They started off the millennium with a very left-wing government, that was left-wing on social issues, very much so, and they were really popular. People did not have a problem with them at all. if anything, the reason why they kind of fell out of power was just like petty little, in-party kind of conflict.
Yeah, there was a lot of fracturing within the Liberal parties, weren't there, or the left-wing parties.
Absolutely. It wasn't a case of, Polish people just suddenly becoming right-wing. It was like very much a political game, which kind of shows how quickly, populist techniques can turn a population into what is kind of seen in Poland
shows
right now.
the potency of populism and just how quick and how quickly it can act and how powerful it is.
And I suppose what's really important about things like that and about context like that is that it shows that none of this is intractable.
Mm-hmm.
As much as Law and Justice Party, the populist party that we'll be chatting about, says that they are the voice of the Polish people.
Yeah.
That's not always been the case, and that can change just
Absolutely.
as quickly as the left-wing government's changed into Law and Justice.
Yeah, absolutely. So you might be wondering how we got here, what happened there, and what I thought was really interesting, which I also found out recently enough, is that PiS actually were in power in 2005 for a while, and they utilised a lot of very populist techniques, very elites versus us sort of mentality. Also, as like the left-wing parties were becoming kind of more verbally, socially left-wing. They were talking about LGBT rights, they were talking about abortion. PiS very much jumped in there and tried to scare people with that.
So when the left moved to that kind of cultural axis of progressive politics, PiS, or Law and Justice, we should preface that those are the same thing. Essentially, PiS is the Polish abbreviation for it, yeah? They kind of attacked them on that cultural front.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
took advantage of more conservative views.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is, as a party, they weren't very well structured and they had like problems. So they came into power in 2005. 2 years later, their whole government collapsed, and we went back to centrism, and we just kind of there wasn't that much of a
centrism.
And then we had a centrist government from 2007 2015, which is very interesting. So they had like a little bit of a populist spark. And then they were like, okay, never mind, this isn't working.
It's really interesting that the more centrist government came back into power like around the exact same time as the financial crisis, and that gave lots of opportunities to PiS, didn't it?
Absolutely. So will we move on to...
So the next part that I think we want to talk about here is like how actually did Law and Justice get into power?
Yeah.
Like what was how did that happen? How did they go from that, going back to a centrist government, how did they take advantage of the political climate at the time to maintain like their iron grip on power that they have right now? Yeah,
so there were a lot of factors that went into it, of course. First of all, the centrist government, like I said, was in power from 2007 to 2015. That was a really, really long time, and people were kind of sick of it. And, the party wasn't really putting forward any kind of radical change ideas. And, after that length of time, people are kind of just getting frustrated and just looking for, answers in other parties, ... And also, and that kind of fed into the very elitist view. It was, PiS kind of took advantage of, the centrist government being in power for so long, and the economy was growing massively, and especially in the cities in Warsaw. Economy was absolutely booming. However, a lot of people in rural areas wouldn't have seen any of that. So that gave PiS, or Law and Justice, just a little segment to really fixate on.
They had the same sort of mechanism that a lot of populist parties do, and they profited both off their own exclusion from government, with two parties for a long time were in power. It was a two-party system for quite some time, but they were coalitions, not parties. That's a whole different story. But at the same time, they took advantage of how the people in rural Poland felt excluded as well. And so they aligned their exclusion from parliament with the rural people, people in rural Poland's exclusion just from the economic progress.
I think it's important to note as well, as much as we might disagree with their cultural ideas and some of their policies and their form of government and the way they've treated freedom and stuff like that, there is a reason why they got into power.
Absolutely, and why they're staying in it for so long.
It's a result of actions taken by other parties, with regards to like how the economic recovery went about. We'll see that definitely in Ireland and probably in Hungary as well, where people felt left out of the economic recovery after the crash, and those people were promised solutions by
Absolutely. And economic policy is still just the most relevant thing when you look at Law and Justice and why they are in power. Like their most popular policy ever, which I think if they did nothing else, they would still be able to get as many votes as they're getting now, is they introduced child benefits, and people get 500 zloty per child per month. And that makes a massive difference, especially in rural areas. And people do associate that policy with them. They did a lot with pensions. They actually they decreased the retirement age after the centrist government before them had increased it. And when people, are associating them with those kind of policies, it's very hard for other parties to say, oh, well, we're not going to take away your child benefit when we go and get into power. Because people, their experience says differently. And I guess I can't blame people for, trusting those kind of like populist tactics when, they are constantly being told like law and justice is the only reason why you have this money.
It does seem that law and justice have improved living standards in general in Poland a lot since coming into power in 2015. And so, you really have to, I don't want to applaud them much, but you have to applaud them for that. I'm sure we don't know the long-term effects of their economic policies yet, and a lot of people criticize populist economic policy for its long-term effects, but in the short run, they've done a brilliant job, I think, at
Absolutely.
increasing standards of living.
And it's something I really want to emphasize as well, because I do think, Poland is getting a very bad rep for a variety of reasons, and some of them are very true. But I don't like, when there's a lot of focus internationally on the social issues like abortion, LGBT rights. And I don't think Polish people are inherently I want to say so bad. I do think the primary reason why they are voting the way they are is because they're scared for their economic stability, and you can't really blame people for that. They're voting
for their livelihoods. They're voting, for their own families.
There is because populism pits the people against the elites. One of the probably more problematic ways of criticizing populism is to say that, oh well, the people just don't know. The people are bad. The people are uneducated and all this.
Yeah.
Whereas, you actually have to try and think and figure out, well, why are they doing this?
Exactly.
What is the motivation behind this form of politics, essentially?
Exactly. And the role of media plays in a lot there, because a lot of, especially maybe some of the older population, still completely rely on kind of the national news sources, which are not being honest in any way. I always think of my granddad with this, who is an amazing man and just very, very kind man, wouldn't hurt a fly. But he gets all of his news from Law and Justice Party. And I understand why he has some of the social views that he does have that might be, a bit anti-minorities just in general, because the information that he is being provided with is so different from reality. And even if if you compare my granddad to my mom, right, who should have similar values, they grew up in the same kind of, manner and, the same family, obviously. But simply just getting news from private media or public media, it makes all the difference.
It's the way I see populism, at least in Europe, is as it's a Trojan horse. It's this bit gift of great economic growth, but inside it, at least in European cases, seems to be social agendas that people are tend to trust because
Absolutely.
The Populist Party has done so well for them economically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So just in terms of that social agenda, who do they other, essentially, peace in Poland, who is the other, the outside group?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is definitely a little bit of the elitism kind of esque thing there. But I think in recent times, it has turned a little bit more anti-EU. And especially with relation to obviously like the immigration crisis, right, from 2015, that was like a very, very relevant thing for a lot of countries. They have very much turned against just people outside of Poland, very, very nationalistic tendencies there. It's obviously very easy to focus on LGBT people who they very much describe, they describe like the LGBT community as an ideology in itself, and an ideology that's coming from the EU, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many LGBT people would consider the EU to be their vehicle of choice for social change.
Exactly. But I do think the interesting thing there is they utilize that sort of us versus them mentality a lot of the times when they are doing some other sketchy things behind the scenes.
Oh, yes.
So when they are changing the constitution, or they're doing crazy thing with the judiciary, they focus on LGBT rights, and that gets all the press, internationally especially, and it kind of gives them the freedom to completely change the system in order to benefit them.
They want.
So
exactly.
Yeah, just to annoy Ryan even more here, that was essentially a policy that or a tactic that Trump used a lot back in his time. Essentially, like creating stoking some kind of culture war, conflict on social media, right?
Yeah.
While in the background, he was replacing heads of departments with people who were completely unqualified and would just serve to push their own agenda. And he was engaged in all this cronyism and stuff like that.
That's exactly it.
It's to an extent they do have a social agenda, but I suppose to another extent it's a tactic for creating popular momentum behind themselves so they can maintain their grip on power.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is really interesting. It makes you wonder. It's hard to know where exactly they stand socially, because I think around elections and around the times when they are messing something up, they do talk about like these issues. But for example, with presidential election just there last year, Andrzej Duda, who did actually win, focused the last 2 weeks of his campaign were all about how anti-LGBT he is. And then as soon as he won, he went out and said, oh no, I don't think LGBT people are that bad.
Okay.
And that's kind of a reaction where he's like, I'm in power now. I don't want to maybe anger kind of like the international community too much.
Yes.
So they do kind of sway a little bit, which is really interesting. And it just shows that it's all about power.
But at the same time, when he did get into power, even if he did like reverse his speech or like his outward expression against LGBT people, one of the first things I believe he did when coming into power, at least for the second time, was to support the creation of LGBT-free zones. Yes, so I don't think I don't believe it was just for power, like it,
That's very true, but the way they speak about it is definitely very, very tactical. And then what they do policy-wise behind the scenes is a whole nother story.
Like their principles mightn't be great, but they don't even stick to their principles anyway.
Yeah,
so
very much.
Can I ask what is happening now in Poland? Where are we at now with peace?
Yeah. So this is really interesting because, when you look to the next, 5 or 10 years, you wonder, can they keep this up? Populist parties can't always stay in power for very, very long because, they have like a particular like agenda that they kind of really
after
focus
a while
on.
they become the elite as well.
That's exactly it.
There's only so far you can go with the...
That's exactly it. But what's really interesting now is there's actually a new populist party forming. And it's so interesting because for the last, decade and a bit, the political power has very much been divided by Law and Justice and the main opposition party, which I think is called Civic Platform in English. It's PEL in Polish. And what this new party is trying to do is fill the gap between Law and Justice, which are very right-wing, and then PEL, which are like very centrist. So they're trying to fill the gap in the centre-right, which is quite interesting. And they are approaching it in a way where they're like, it's been these two parties for so long, we need change.
Yeah, like there's I suppose you can tell me whether or not this is part of their manifesto or their appeal, but there's an element of populism where not having had political power becomes a selling point.
Absolutely.
Because you're not part of what came before. And so voters don't know your record. And if they don't like the record of the last party, then you can make the argument that you should be given power just to see.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely. And that's also true for Confederation, which is Ryan's favourite radical right party.
Oh no.
It's very true for them. As far as left, you might be wondering, hey, where are the left-wingers? I haven't mentioned them since 2005. Kind of.
What did they get up to?
Yeah, they've been kind of irrelevant. They had an electoral cycle there where they weren't in government at all. They're now, I think, getting about 8-9%. Which isn't great. A lot can happen there. They could build themselves up very well, or they could completely stay irrelevant.
It's I think the left wing in Poland's strongest feature could have been economic policy. It could have been really Poland, especially in during the financial crash, there was such chance there for redistributive policies and to aid the working class, which is a left wing thing.
Exactly.
But in Poland, with populist parties, that's especially populist right parties. The right somehow took this thing of redistribution from the left, and it's now
I suppose you can always there's always a discussion there about whether or not you can have left-wing policies with right-wing cultural issues and conservative cultural values. And I'd say to be fully ideologically honest with yourself, you probably can't. But you can practically, and that's what they're doing. They're putting in these redistributive policies along with cultural values that are, antithetical to what their economic values are supposed to be, which is free, fair jobs for everyone.
Absolutely.
Not the gays,
and
not the.
And it's very hard to run a platform only on left-wing social issues when that economic aspect of it is completely taken away from you.
Yeah.
So I do really feel for left-wing parties. I hope that they pick it up. I'll be there within the next 5 years to save the day. Don't worry. But yeah, I do think at this stage, Polish politics could go in absolutely any direction, radical right or left, or radical right or centre left. But I'd take it.
Okay, so
I kind of rambled on a little bit there. Feeling quite happy. Should I say my little Polish joke now? I think it's a good time.
Okay, go for it.
I have a really good Polish joke. Okay, are you ready for this? So,
no.
If someone is 10% Polish, they're 10% Polish. They have 10% Polish DNA, Ryan.
Okay.
Does that make them a tadpole?
I have never hated anything more in my life.
Hold on, there's more. Or some would say a tent pole.
If this window could open wider, I would have been outed half an hour ago.
I'm just glad the people who designed halls thought of that, Ryan. Because
I think I'm hilarious.
Okay.
we know.
That's my phrase.
Right. Moving swiftly on.
Anyways. Anyone feeling Hungary? See?
Oh my.
It's too easy.
Yeah. Ryan, so would you like to do something or give us a brief introduction to the history of populism in Hungary and where it's come from?
Right, okay, I'm going to preface this as usual with, I actually started researching this last night. Usually I research things about 3 days before, but it's been a very busy week, so I researched this last night and this morning.
To be fair, you did a lot of work on it.
Absolutely.
100%. The man has an impressive document here.
It's all copied and pasted from great sources, I promise you.
Also, check the show notes on Spotify for some of the sources we used. If you want to do any reading on this yourself, definitely recommend looking. Especially, you really like this paper.
I really like this paper. I will be linking it. It's a great paper. It's one of my favourite papers I've ever read, actually. Anyway, populism in Hungary. It's very similar, I think, to populism in Poland. It has been. It's just a bit. It's been a bit stronger in recent years.
It's further along the process.
A man called Weeks did a study in 2008, and he came to the conclusion that populism was very weak in Hungary. It wasn't very present. But populism came to Hungary with the financial crash. Right after the financial crash of 2008-2009, Fidesz, the now ruling party, adopted sort of a populist ideology, and started framing it as people versus elites, classic populist stuff. But it's difficult to determine whether, usually people class populism as either economic or political, and it's kind of difficult in Hungary to determine which one it is. It's a lot more social populism than I think, or political populism than it is in Poland. Poland's very economic populism.
Okay.
But scientists say anyway.
What do you mean by political populism there?
More focused on social issues like
right,
immigration and
And definitely, it's a lot farther along that authoritarian path. You could say they're probably on similar paths, but in Hungary, it's very worrying.
Yeah. There's two kind of populist parties in Hungary, and the first one is called Jobbik. It's a bit farther right than the ruling party right now, which is quite something. It's more focused on economic populism. It's very strong in rural Hungary, where poverty and unemployment rates are very high. There's a strong ethnic tension between Hungarians and the Roma minority. It positions itself as the party of the poor and nationalist Hungarians who want to fight against the elite. Blah blah blah. We've heard it all before. It's seen as more an economic populist party, whereas the ruling party right now, Fidesz, it's currently a Fidesz and KDNP, I believe, government, which is the Hungarian Christian Democratic Party. Fidesz is more, it's politically populist, at least the social scientists say. I'm just quoting them. The ideology of Fidesz is nationalistic, but the party claims that the main goal of Fidesz is to protect national interests from foreign powers, which are making attempts to take control over Hungary and not to
That's their main point of the party?
That's the main point of the party, it's not that foreign...
That says a lot, because it's not like our main point is for the happiness of the Hungarian people, for well-being, or to create a fair and equal society. It's to protect us from the outside powers.
Well, yeah, they place the blame on Hungary's current situation on international powers attempting to take control of them, and foreign interests interfering with their national interests through the policies of the EU. They're very, very anti-EU. I think anyone who's done a wee bit of politics has seen that by now.
Yeah, and I think just in context of the European Union, it's interesting how Hungary and Poland are good friends.
Oh, they have such an alliance. Power couple, some would say.
Because one country, in a lot of the European Council meetings, one country can't veto, but two countries can.
Absolutely.
Which was essentially a rule there to stop small countries being bullied by the big countries. So if there was one autocratic country that was trying to push the boundaries of what was allowed in the EU, that wouldn't be allowed. They wouldn't get the veto.
Yeah.
But then they got two. So,
I think Fidesz's ideology can be summed up in what Viktor Orban said when he was first elected in about 2010, I think it was, in May 2019 actually, quite a while after 2010, when he got elected to take a seat in the EU, I believe, in the European Parliament. Viktor Orban said that it was a sign that the Hungarian people wanted the delegates to represent the interests of the Hungarian people in Brussels and not the interests of Brussels and Hungary.
There's because the EU is it does give a lot of fodder for that kind of nationalistic populist elite thing, because you can frame the elite as being Brussels and the EU forcing all these cultural values on us, and forcing all these rules on us and these regulations, also forcing these subsidies on us. But
how dare they give us money?
Yeah, we generally don't mention that. And I know there's issues in Hungary with the misappropriation of EU funds and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to go on to the populist characteristics then that you find in this party?
Well, I think I've talked about a lot of them already, so I'll make it brief. It really is about challenging the elite being the EU, being the European international powers. The left-wing parties in around 2008 handled the financial crash very poorly, and the Hungarian people really suffered. It's the same as Poland, and that gave a real opportunity for populist Fidesz to rise up.
To take advantage of that kind of dissatisfaction among the people.
Yeah.
And that's there's no point trying to create a people versus the elite dynamic
if the elite haven't failed.
If there's
people
no
in the past.
grievance there for the people to blame upon the elite, you know?
Like Fidesz promised to bring change to the country, to correct the mistakes of liberal governments, and to prioritise the interests of Hungarian people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's no, I wouldn't be fully read up on this, but Viktor Orban came out of the anti-USSR student-led movement in the late 90s, or in the early 90s, sorry.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
Hungary is the same as Poland probably, and that like having an international power try to control you is quite a sensitive topic for it.
Absolutely. And actually, now that you say that, kind of the main guy behind the whole law and justice operation, Jarosław Kaczynski, he was very active in the anti-USSR movement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is something to say there.
I think just to bring in kind of the charisma thing that we were chatting about earlier, and the strongman, right? Is there an element in these cases where these people have a kind of heritage or a pedigree about them because they were involved in the founding of the state and because they were leading the movement against the USSR for the people, for that nation to come through? Is there an element there where they're accepted as such strongmen leaders and such authoritarian leaders because they have that pedigree from that time?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think Poland is a bit of an odd example in that, I mean, the guy I'm talking about, Jarosław Kaczynski, he wouldn't be, the prime minister, he wouldn't be the president, he's leader of the party. So he wouldn't really be, in the same way as Viktor Orban is, kind of the face of everything that's going on. Everyone's well aware that he's the one pushing the buttons.
Yeah.
But he isn't really, publicly as present. And that makes sense in the context of what we're saying about anti-USSR, because even though I say he was very involved in the movement, he wasn't one of the main guys at all.
Okay.
There was a big labour union, and there was very specific leaders that kind of led that movement. But I'm sure that even his association with that and the fact that he was doing something, and he was on the right side of history in that kind of Polish context. It definitely looks good. It looks good.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone knows, shoot us a DM there. Why not?
Yeah, I'm gonna skip over the economic policy or populist policy of Fidesz. Like it's much the same as Poland, I believe. And we're running very short in time because we're very smart people with a lot of things to say. So go on, Evan.
So I just want to, I suppose to build on that, what you were saying before there. What are the techniques that they've used to hold power?
There are very standard techniques by populist parties being used here in Hungary. The main goal of, or to hold, the main method of holding on to power by Fidesz is occupying the state, as a man called Müller said in 2016.
Okay, right. So it's power focused. Like they're a party for power.
Yeah, as soon as they got into power, the main thing, agenda was, okay, now how do we maintain it for a long period of time? Now that may sound familiar to a lot of people from.
I know that's you could say that about every party, that they're looking just for power, but would you call their ideology or their policies more malleable than, or is that a feature in it at all? Am I just straws there?
That's not really the way I read into it. It's not really through they don't really identify themselves with the people. They attempt to get the people to identify with them, and it's been working so far. They don't change themselves with the people. Really, It doesn't seem. The main thing that they've been doing is changing the constitution and changing governmental institutions to make it easier for them to stay in power. They changed the electoral system in 2014, I think it was. Just for redefining regulations and remapping the electoral districts. The new system allows the party, the new system allows the party receiving the most percentage of votes to earn more seats in the parliament than it did before, which is really
if you, I don't know, I'm not sure the proportions there, but essentially, if you don't get a majority of the votes, you can still get a majority of the seats in the parliament.
Very
or
easily.
If you get a slim majority in the votes, you can get a massive majority in parliament, which makes it much easier for them to implement their agenda if they're not constantly worrying about what their MPs are going to do.
Yeah, and the most worrying way in which I think they're maintaining their power is they've introduced a parallel court system. So a new set of courts has been established to deal with state matters, and everyone in these courts, the whole judiciary, I can't say judiciary. Oh my goodness, I can't say it.
Much to think about.
Much to think about.
Should we take you to a parallel court system?
Yeah, that'd be great. Everyone in this court that deals with state matters is appointed by the government. So they're all appointed by Viktor Orban. So like there's no way that you can take the
the buck stops with him essentially. Like he's at the top.
Exactly. And everyone, I forgot to mention this earlier, there was several service law introduced that really in the public service, everyone is accountable to Fidesz. Everyone's accountable to the ruling party at the time, and not just surely if they got if they lost an election, it would be the new ruling party. But currently, the civil service law means that everyone in every public sector has to comply with Fidesz, and it's very easy. Like they made it easier to kick people out from positions, and it's like Fidesz have replaced so many important public figures in political institutions with people that were loyal to them for a long time and suddenly left the party. And
it reminds me of a quote. I think it's attributed to Matteo Salvini in Italy, which is we're obviously not going into Italian populism yet, but that was essentially Italy's where populism in Europe was born in the 21st century. And he said that for a populist party, law follows politics as opposed to politics following the law.
Absolutely.
yeah,
Which is very much like, because they claim this mandate for themselves that they are the voice of the people, then it doesn't matter what the constitution says, they have a right to change it,
well, I'm going to skip over the whole.
Obviously, it makes sense that if the people wanted to change the constitution, it should be changed. But the point here is that these parties don't represent the kind of majority that they
claim they represent because of tampering of electoral systems and all the rest. We're going way over time here, so what I'm going to do is just mention the fact that a lot of the media in Hungary, a lot of the media, future Poland, a lot of the media in Hungary
Tuesday
is controlled by the state and all the rest. Viktor Orban owns a lot of the media, and again, since it's public service, the new civil service law meant that everyone in the media was accountable to him and could be replaced very easily with people who are loyal to the state. I saw that in reading a lot of Hungarian media, which it portrayed life in Hungary as very good. Apparently, poverty rates dropped from 23.4% when they came into power in 2010 to 8.7% in 2020. But this is also from state-controlled media. Any sort of external accounts that I read didn't have the same optimism about life in Hungary. Now, I can't speak about it. You'd have to speak to. I believe Laszlo's Hungarian, isn't he?
Oh, true.
If you
We have a Hungarian friend.
yes, I'm sure he'd be much better qualified to chat about it to me. But essentially, the media seems to be claiming, the state media, that living standards have increased tenfold since the Populist Party came into power in 2010. But there's a lot of dispute about that.
Right. So you can see the parallels there between Hungary and Poland.
Absolutely.
Obviously, they feed off each other in the EU and against the EU. They create a kind of an outside view of we are the Hungarian people, we are the Polish people, and that liberal elite and those the LGBTQ plus community and the elites in Brussels, they're all against us, and they're kind of a conspiracy. To keep us down, essentially, right? And they feed off kind of an economic inequality as well, right?
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about Sinn Féin for a minute here, just to bring it back to Ireland, right? So
can I just point to the fact that Evan's notes on this matter begin with Sinn Féin.
Okay, I thought that was very funny. I'm not biased or anything here.
Okay.
No. So Sinn Féin, are they a populist party? I suppose it depends what you mean by populist, right? And we've been talking about populism in a negative context, mostly because of the cultural agenda that's associated with it.
Yeah, in both our case studies, social issues that came with populism were very right wing. They were very anti, they were very harsh to minorities and all the rest.
Yeah. So Sinn Féin are a different kind of populist party, and Owen O'Brien, right, their housing spokesperson, says they are an unashamedly populist party himself.
Okay.
So he takes that label and he says that it's not a bad thing. We represent the people against the elite.
Yeah,
the people
that's
should be
very
represented against the elite. So in terms of that, you want to ask who are the elites? Who are the people? Of course, in the north, I don't know if you could call it populism, but Sinn Féin obviously comes out of the IRA and that thing in the 70s. They were very much from the 70s right up to the late 90s. They were very much a marginal political force, a mouthpiece for the IRA for a very long time, until for the provisional IRA until the 2000s when they really started entering into Irish politics, and they couldn't because the British government isn't as or the British state itself isn't as prominent in the south of Ireland, essentially in the Republic. They couldn't really other that group. They couldn't say that, oh, we're not the Unionists. They had to find something else, and the crash provided that.
Yeah.
Essentially, we are not Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, and we are not. Right. Seems to have lost our connection there. Oh, there we go. That's good.
Yay!
Yes, we're back again. We still haven't sorted out issues from last week, but that will be done. So that's the elite for them is very much this economic elite in Dublin, and they're not really Eurosceptic. They're more what they call Eurocritical, because I don't think there's a market for that in Ireland, to be honest.
No.
I just think that's probably a supply and demand kind of thing.
Yeah, like the EU has done incredibly well for Ireland. It's been
100%. Yeah, like I think Irish, for us at least, it's been like a source of massive economic investment.
Absolutely. But that said, the single country who gains the most from the EU economically is Poland. So that's not a very, it's not a very clear
Really?
line.
Oh, like
there.
on the net benefits side?
Yeah, absolutely. We get the most money from the EU. We are the fastest growing economy in Europe, not to flex. And so,
Did you even grow, bro?
so I do think maybe it's more to do with just Ireland being a little bit more socially open.
Okay, yeah, I want to go on to that, right? Because there's a very interesting paper, and I'll link it into the thing, about why there is no radical right party in Ireland.
Yes.
And the conclusion of it is that Sinn Féin occupies that demographic and to some extent ideological space that in other countries is occupied by those radical right parties that are anti-immigrant, anti-EU, that kind of thing, right? So the general idea here is that because Sinn Féin takes that working class economic vote, but because of the history of Irish nationalism, which has historically been fairly inclusive, even if it hasn't been literally inclusive of all religions and minorities and stuff like that, it has prided itself and thought of itself as being inclusive of those different groups.
Absolutely.
And so it's very hard for Sinn Féin to come out with an explicit message against immigrants.
Because we're great.
Yeah.
Because immigrants in Ireland are great. Just to put that out there.
Thanks, Olivia.
We bring so much.
Like it's really interesting because the Irish people have such a history of being oppressed that the working class aligns themselves with other oppressed groups and minorities being often oppressed groups.
It'd be very dissonant for Sinn Féin to say, oh, we can't let immigrants in, when to some extent the Irish there's the whole thing with the diaspora and Irish people are all over the world and we're immigrants, we went everywhere. For them to say then, it's probably the reason why that hasn't grown here. And I just want to point out then about Sinn Féin and how another reason why they haven't, we've got that cultural reason. The other reason is that they occupy that demographic space or at least they did to the last election where they're now occupying a much more larger or wider space, but their core vote is men in their 20s. Who and the working class vote, who in other countries tend to be associated with voting for more right wing parties.
Absolutely.
So it shows that there's nothing inherent about these right wing parties in other countries. That this demographic, there's nothing, and there's no particular reason why those countries are why those parties have to be racist, or why they have to be anti-immigrant. It's politically convenient in that context, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, that's all very interesting, Evan. But what does Karl Barx think of all of this?
That's a very good point. We'll put Karl on the mic now.
That's actually really interesting.
I wouldn't have thought of that myself.
That's a very interesting point, Karl, there. Thank you.
And you see, what that reminds me of is how how Sinn Féin's economic policy is very much connected as well to economic policies of Fídeas. I'm not saying that right, but I'll move on.
The Hungarian party.
The Hungarian party, Viktor Orban, right? And then the peace in Poland, right?
Yeah.
Like that economic policy, their economics is populist. It's populist insofar as it seeks redistribution, it seeks progressive taxation, taxing wealthier people more.
Yeah.
And you spend that money on investment and like also a lot of investment in public services. Like a big thing in Ireland right now is housing.
Yeah.
And Sinn Féin has a big thing to say on housing, right? That's a big part of their thing. Their distinction from Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael is that their housing policy is social housing for everyone. And Owen O'Brien is he's very active on that policy front about that, talking about how like they want to build houses by the government for the people and give them to people for free, and to take away that stigma against council houses and things like that. And those kind of getting the government more involved in the state and talking like dismissing the elite, the property elite on top of this economic ladder essentially.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's interesting the parallels between all three, right? I don't know if you could call them, like obviously if they're a populist at all, they're left-wing populist. But you still have to ask then, is being populist a bad thing?
Yes, and that's a really interesting question. Evan asked me that earlier and I had to sit down for a while thinking about it because, when I think of populism, I think populism in Poland and what it's done to Poland and what Law and Justice are doing. But I guess there's nothing intrinsically bad about a party fighting for people who are forgotten.
I think, the question comes in how do you define the people and how do you define the elite?
Yeah.
Is it a distinction that's literally there, and does it reflect something that's actually, are you being genuine about that, or does it reflect a simplified view of how society's worked and a simplified view of history that's not correct at all?
Like what I said earlier in the podcast and earlier on when Evan asked me this question, is populism inherently a bad thing? I see populism as always as a vehicle. I always see it I see economic populism especially as a vehicle for social issues. We've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in Hungary. It's a vehicle to get into power and push a social agenda, and I'd say the same could be said of Sinn Féin.
We haven't touched on their
United Ireland, but I do see, whether or not you consider United Ireland to be a good thing, I do think it's, they don't conceal it as much as Poland and Hungary do, but I think it is it's a feature of their populism that's more like...
Yeah.
They come into power with the populism and then push the social agenda afterwards.
Absolutely.
That's the big criticism of them from other parties, is that they're promising all this stuff just so they can get into power and call a referendum, or at least push for it and create the climate for that.
Absolutely.
So like it's hard to figure out exactly where to stand on that, because at the end of the day, a lot of political scientists believe that populism shouldn't be a word at all, and it shouldn't be a distinction.
And they're probably right.
Yeah, I do like that.
Oh Jesus! Right.
No, I don't think populism should have the same status as an ideology as it does today.
Absolutely.
I think it should be. I think populism should be classified as a strategy, not an ideology.
Dead right there. Right.
Will we leave it there?
I think we want to say a few Polish words. I've been doing a really good job teaching them. Yeah.
I'm ready for this. Will I go first or you, Evan?
You go first there.
Right. Well, what I have to say to you all is thank you very much, and wszystkiego najlepszego.
Okay. My Polish word is śmierć.
And I just want to say dziękuję bardzo, że słuchaliście. Mogę mówić cały dzień i nikt mnie nie zrozumie. Dzięki.
Dead right.
Right. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thanks. And for the next 5 minutes, we'll play some disco polo for you all.
Oh
yes.
God, help
Yes.
us.
Thank you very much.